But at the same time, and this is very important, the Saudis, the Emiratis, and others informed the United States that they would not permit American operations against Iran from their territory. And Iran warned those states that if they did, they would become targets. So in a sense, Iran has achieved the neutralization of American forces in the Persian Gulf that it long sought.
Hello, everybody. This is Pascal from Neutrality Studies, and today I have the great pleasure and honor to again talk to Ambassador Chas Freeman. I know most of you know him. He is a very great speaker and writer and thinker. He served as U.S. Ambassador to Saudi Arabia. He was the Assistant Secretary of Defense in the 1990s, and he was also Nixon's principal interpreter during his 1972 visit to China. He's one of the America's greatest living foreign policy legends. And a while ago, I talked to him. He's shaking his head, but he really is. A while ago, he was talking about the Middle East and that it would make much more sense now that we have a realignment between Iran and Saudi Arabia and other events, that we think about this place rather about West Asia than about the Eurocentric Middle East. And that was before October 7th. That was before the start of what has to be described as genocide, and what I am absolutely certain will be remembered in world history as a genocide. Ambassador Freeman, welcome to this show, and thank you for taking the time for an update.
Well, thank you for the flattering remarks.
Well, you know, I am very impressed with all of the things you've done, because you speak fluent Chinese, you speak fluent Arabic, you have been in foreign policy for a very long time, and now you're one of these voices that dares to speak out and actually frames things. You help us think about world affairs, and I really wonder how you everything that happened since October 7th, how does it impact your views on the Middle East?
Well, it certainly had a major impact. I was initially a fan of Zionism in the 1950s. I admired what I thought Israel was. I became a skeptic, and then I became a critic as I watched what Israel was doing. But I've come to realize a number of things that I didn't know. For example, when Israel says or demands that others acknowledge its right to exist, what does it mean? It means no one else has the right to exist between the Jordan River and the sea. It is a positive statement of a negative proposition, which is integral to Zionism. That is to say, that from the very beginning, the phrase, a people without land for a land without people, implied that there were no people in Palestine. And Israel has devoted itself to ensuring that that is the case. And this has now been brutally revealed in the genocide in Gaza, where Israel would be very happy to push the Palestinian population out, but failing that, it will kill them, either bombing them or starving them to death. This is a level of cruelty, evil, if you will, that I could not have imagined. And it's particularly hard to understand coming from a population in which at least the European segment are the victims of a Holocaust, the Holocaust in Europe. Of course, the Arab Jews, the Mizrahim, the Oriental Jews, did not experience that. But we've now had the Israeli state conduct a program of indoctrination of its entire population, including those from Arab lands who were forced to leave when Israel was established. And for the first time, there was a serious reaction against them in the Arab world. These people are now indoctrinated. They're taken to Auschwitz to be told that the entire world, all the non-Jewish world, wants to murder them. So this is a country which is now, the only word for it I can think of is psychopathic. It is a country that has dehumanized the indigenous population to the extent that its people feel no compunction at all about mass murder, including the murder of women and children, including the murder of infants. And theologians in Israel justify this. I could not have imagined this. And I cannot imagine anything farther from the tenets of Judaism as I have known it in the West. And therefore, I've come to the conclusion that Zionism is the negation of Judaism. It is not Judaism. It is not humane. It does not depend upon ethical reasoning conducted through scholarship, which is the essence of Judaism. It is a fascist form of nationalism, and we are seeing that played out. So the October 7th and the subsequent events have had a profound effect on my view of things. I've also got to say that as an American, I'm deeply ashamed of the enablement of genocide that my countries have been engaged in. The antics of the United States at the Security Council, most recently today, with the veto of the proposal to admit Palestine as a state on the grounds that we support a two-state solution, which we have never really conducted a sufficient effort to support, is egregiously dishonest. And I think it deprives us of any remaining credibility in the world that we have had. So as an American, I'm deeply distressed. I love my country. I want it to be safe and secure. I want it to succeed. It cannot succeed if it engages in this kind of duplicity, deception, dishonesty, hypocrisy, and double standards. On the one hand, we condemn Russia for conducting warfare in Ukraine, some of which undoubtedly has included gross violations of Ukrainian human rights. On the other hand, we don't condemn Israel for doing something far more egregious and lethal. And so this is deeply distressing to me. I really have not slept well for 6 months.
Same. I just wonder, what we are witnessing here has a very special quality, because what I mean with quality is the double speak. So, dishonesty in foreign policy, dishonesty in political discourse in general is nothing new. But it is difficult to find a time when we have equally clear evidence for something egregious happening, while at the same time the enablers, the conducting power and the enablers pretend that there's no proof for that. Kirby said on state TV, we have no proof that there a single human rights abuse has actually taken place, or a war crime. Sorry, he said war crime. We don't have a single proof for a war crime, and Israel keeps saying we are just defending ourselves while literally going into Gaza and attacking that place. Repelling the attacker is one thing, but then going in and after them is a completely different thing, and especially if it costs like 40,000 lives and probably more, large part of them civilians and children. And this is happening in the open. And you were the one who said they are worse than the Nazis on my former program, because the Nazis tried to hide the Holocaust. They tried to hide it. And then it came out, and only post facto, everybody learned how huge a crime that was. The US and so on, the others did not go to war to stop the Holocaust. They went to war because the Japanese attacked them, and then Hitler did something stupid. And, but this is the first time that such a large crime is done with pride and also with strategic intent, and the Western world is pretending it's not happening. And the others can see that. Everybody else is seeing it in the global majority. The Russians are seeing it, the Chinese are seeing it, the South Americans are seeing it, and everybody is saying this is outrageous. How do you think this changes the entire equation of global politics?
Well, I think one thing is clear, and that is that Israel no longer has any credibility at all. Anything it says is immediately suspected of being duplicitous and dishonest. But the United States is not far behind. Think about it. Israel attacked an embassy in Damascus. This is a violation of one of the very most basic norms of international relations, going back many thousands of years to the classical world, enshrined in the Vienna Convention on Diplomatic Relations. The United States, Britain, and France vetoed the condemnation of that act. And then we have statements by people like Lord Cameron of Britain, the foreign secretary, who says that the very carefully contrived, performative, symbolic retaliation by Iran was disproportionate to the blowing up of the embassy, in which a general and diplomats and others were killed. And yet no one perished from the Iranian attack, because they very carefully signaled that they were going to do it. They gave 72 hours of notice. They used slow-moving drones to signal that they were engaged in an attack. They timed cruise missiles and ballistic missiles for the arrival of those drones. And they did all this aiming purely at military targets, no civilian target. And actually, they hit the military targets. We don't know how severely, because the Israelis are lying about the damage. But it appears that in the major base in the south, where they struck, they were able to achieve a level of accuracy that was quite extraordinary. They seem to have hit the officers' club swimming pool and an outbuilding. They didn't kill anybody. They allowed the Israelis to move the F-35s that were stationed there and which conducted the raid on Damascus. So what they showed was they had the capacity to clog and render Israeli defenses overburdened. They now know where all of the radars and anti-missile sites are. They have learned that they can send not their best missiles, but older missiles and strike an Israeli base. They have now said, well, from our point of view, we've made our point. We're not planning to do anything else. We don't know what Israel's going to do, but Israel is threatening retaliation. Iran has said that if that happens, instead of 320 flying objects going toward Israel, there will be 1,500. So basically, this changes all the rules of the game in the Middle East. Iran had practiced a policy called strategic patience, which basically was passivity. If it was attacked, as it often was by Israel, if its officers, military, scientific, government, politicians were assassinated, as many were, it did not retaliate in kind. Sometimes it assisted its clients, other resistance movements in the region, Hezbollah, for example, in Lebanon, to carry out some kind of retaliatory act, but it never acted directly. Israel therefore felt that with American protection, to which I'll come in a moment, it had a free hand in the Middle East. It could act with impunity. That is no longer the case. And I know that at the cost of maybe $20 million in missile firings, drones that cost a few $1,000s, cruise missiles that cost a few $100,000, and ballistic missiles that are more expensive, Iran probably cost Israel $1.3 billion in defense efforts, succeeded in panicking the Israeli population over the course of the weekend, demonstrated that it can overwhelm Israel's defenses if it chooses to do so, and also that Israel cannot defend itself without the active participation of the United States, the UK, France, and in this case, Jordan, acting against drones crossing its territory. A final point here is that there's a great deal made of the so-called cooperation of Arab states with Israel against Iran. What was that? And with the exception of Jordan, which did act to shoot down drones crossing its territory, the only participation was intelligence sharing. That is, Saudi Arabia and others informed the United States and Israel of the tracks of the missiles coming across their territory. At the same time, and this is very important, the Saudis, the Emiratis, and others informed the United States that they would not permit American operations against Iran from their territory. And Iran warned those states that if they did, they would become targets. So in a sense, Iran has achieved the neutralization of American forces in the Persian Gulf that it long sought. So this is, as someone has put it, from a tactical military point of view, it was a nothing burger, to use an American slang expression. It didn't amount to anything. Nobody was killed. Nobody was really damaged. The swimming pool may have a hole in it and at the Navatim air base, but otherwise not much happened. But from a strategic point of view, from a soft power point of view, it was a huge success. Iran accomplished its objective, and it left Israel with an intolerable dilemma. Israel cannot continue to behave as though it can act with impunity. And let me pose a specific question. If Israel now assassinates an Iranian, if President Raisi of Iran's statement is to be believed, Iran will retaliate in kind. That should be sobering. It has not been the case. Iranian restraint has been broken. Furthermore, there are now people in Tehran who, for the first time, are saying openly, in order to counter Israel, we are going to have to go nuclear. So Israel has crossed a line. And let's remember, despite all the spin in the Western press, this particular cycle began with an Israeli provocation, not an Iranian provocation. The Israelis attacked a sacrosanct target, a target that has political and diplomatic immunity, namely the embassy of Iran in Damascus. Iran was put in a position where it had to respond. Apparently, the Israelis misjudged. They thought that, as in the past, despite their escalation against Iran, Iran would continue to exercise strategic restraint. But I don't think the Iranian populace would permit the government in Tehran to do that. And the government in Tehran also has clients in the form of resistance movements against Israel throughout the Middle East, which also would not be impressed if Iran failed to act. Now, some of those resistance movements apparently agree with the spin in the West that, well, Iran didn't do anything, it just showed it was incapable and lacked willpower. I don't think that is correct. And I know that Hezbollah and others do not appear to share that opinion. So the next time Israel does something, and we don't know what it will do, but it is saying now that it does not believe that attacking Iran's clients, its proxies, if you will, in the region would be enough, that it has to act directly against Iran. If it does that, we don't know what's going to happen. The final notion here is that Mr. Netanyahu failed to achieve his 35-year-long objective of generating a war against Iran which would bring the United States in on Israel's side to destroy the largely mythical Iranian nuclear program. Nobody believes that except the politicians in Israel and on Capitol Hill in Washington, that Iran has a nuclear weapons program. What it does have is a program to achieve nuclear latency in case a decision is made, no decision having been made yet, apparently, to build a bomb. And what we're now seeing in Iran is a debate about making a decision to build a bomb. So from every point of view, this is a disaster for Israel, for the West, and it leaves the situation very uncertain.
I I absolutely agree. I wonder why it is that so many people do not see that the big achievements in West Asia and between like cooling down tensions were all achieved diplomatically when the nuclear deal, the JCPOA, was intact, and because everybody, I mean, the observers that came from from neutral states, right, from the Atomic Energy Agency, they all attested, no, Iran is not building any weapons. That was a great achievement, and that was sabotaged in 2016. And then even now, even in the war, in the genocide in Gaza, the only hostages that managed to be exchanged were the ones that were exchanged based on diplomacy. The others are either still in Gaza or were killed by the IDF when they managed to escape. It's like Israel didn't manage to free a single one with force, only with diplomacy. But two more observations that I just would like to get your view on. Maybe Jordan, because when there was this act in the US, right, to give Israel another $3.8 billion about a month and a half ago, about 5-6 weeks ago. And when I read through that act, I saw that there's also the funding act, there's also 1.2 billion to Jordan, which I noticed, but I didn't further think about it. And now I realize, oh, that's actually another 1.2 billion that are spent on another country in order to defend Israel, which makes perfect strategic sense. But Jordan itself, I don't see how Jordan could not shoot down missiles that fly over its sovereign territory, which in a sense helps to de-escalate, right? To make sure that Israel feels safe. What will this do inside of Jordan?
I think that was clearly the Jordanian reasoning was a desire to avoid a wider war. But there's a complication here because a great majority of Jordanians are Palestinian, refugees from Palestine. And in fact, the Queen is a Palestinian. So Jordan is always engaged in a balancing act. And many Jordanians are very angry about the fact that Jordan, in effect, helped to defend Israel. I think the strategic logic of that is, as you stated, it's very clear. Jordan cannot afford a wider war. It does not want to fail to defend Israel to such an extent that Israel feels obliged to invade its airspace. And so this was a defensive move aimed at Jordanian interests, which are derived from Israeli interests in part. So all that is true, and I think it's notable that Jordan, like Egypt, as a result of the Camp David Accords, which were initially with Egypt alone and later expanded to include Jordan, in effect gets bribes from the United States to stay at peace with Israel, regardless of Israeli behavior. Now, that is why Egypt gets the subventions it does. It's why Jordan gets the subventions it does. Jordan is a buffer state between Israel and other countries, Syria, Iraq, and even Saudi Arabia. So it has a certain geopolitical utility, and it's able to derive rent from that. So that is the fact.
The other question on my mind is that your assessment now is that Iran is giving up its strategic restraint strategy and has proven that it can actually overwhelm the Iranian defense. On the other hand, we see that the narrative in the West is clearly actually also de-escalation, right? The United States creating the narrative that this is a win. We shot everything down. Iran is so weak. That's in order to de-escalate and tell the Israelis don't do anything. We actually, at the moment, we have this interesting situation where the US wants to walk away from war, clearly, and tells the Israelis don't they tell them don't shoot back. We don't want this. And it's but the ball is in the court of the Israelis. And my problem is that the Israeli strategy has been the opposite of the Iranian one. It has been strategic overwhelming. If somebody shoots at us, we shoot 10 times back. If somebody kills one of us, we kill 10 or 100 or thousands of them. We will shock them into submission. If the Israelis follow that strategy, I could foresee even like a tactical nuclear strike, something outrageous. Or do you think that the Israelis this time will stand down?
This is the most outrageously belligerent cabinet Israel has ever had. It is composed in part of fanatics. So this is not reassuring. I want to make a number of points. Iran is desperate not to have a war with Israel and the United States. In fact, it's reported that Iran offered, if the United States would bring the Gaza genocide to an end, not to retaliate against Israel. So it was prepared to make a political trade-off. It was only when it became apparent that there's no such willpower on the part of the United States. By the way, the US Congress is on the verge, apparently, of appropriating funds to reimburse Israel for its genocide and allow it to continue that. Anyway, Iran is very restrained. I think the Biden administration behaved in an exemplary fashion in response to the Iranian retaliation against Israel. They helped Israel defend itself. They've now tried to dissuade Israel from continuing the fight. But I don't think they can succeed because I think they fundamentally misread Israeli intentions. And as you said, the Israeli strategy has been diplomacy free. It basically has consisted of disproportionate savagery. And that is the basis for what the Israelis call deterrence. Other people would call it intimidation and terrorism. But Israel basically has sought security by terrorizing its restive native Arab population and its neighbors. The fact that Iran has now said it will retaliate in kind raises real questions about whether Israel can continue that policy. We don't know whether Iran is bluffing or not. Perhaps they are. But I think they've been put in a difficult position with their own clients and their own populace that will require them to make good on their threat to retaliate massively against any, disproportionately, if you will, against any Israeli violence directed at them. So this is a very dangerous situation. You raised the nuclear question. Israel is in the very odd position of denying, or at least not confirming, that it has nuclear weapons while boasting about them and threatening them, others with them. This is a contradiction, but then so much of this is contradictory. One thing you can say about the broader implications of what is happening is that this is the death throes of international law as a force in international politics. You cannot explain the condoning and enablement of genocide in terms of international law. You cannot explain the vetoes of ceasefires in those terms. You cannot explain the failure to condemn an attack on an embassy in those terms. And by the way, there's an echo of that in Quito with the Ecuadorian invasion of the Mexican embassy. So this could be contagious. We should think about that. nobody really likes the United States or the UK in many parts of the world, and our embassies have become fortresses because they've been assaulted in the past. If it's okay in terms of the so-called rules-based order to attack an embassy, then I think we need to watch out. So we are seeing the collapse of everything that has been achieved in terms of regulating international affairs by rules since the 18th century when this began. One can find other examples, but I think the most dangerous is, in fact, in the Middle East. And Israel has made it very clear all along. It's not a signatory of the Non-Proliferation Treaty. It's not subject to inspection. It developed its nuclear weapons clandestinely while lying about what it was doing. It considers that Iran may be doing the same thing it did. That's the basis of its suspicion, or I would say in this case, mostly delusion. But this may be a case of self-fulfilling paranoia in the end. So Israel has talked about something called the Samson option, which basically says, if we go, you all go too. We'll take you down with us, just as Samson pulled down the Philistine temple rather than submit. I think this is very dangerous. And we have people in the war cabinet in Israel who in any other society would probably be locked up as war criminals, as sociopaths, as people who are inciting mob violence. They're guilty of all of that. So what can we say? In the end, I suppose some restraint is imposed on Iran by the judgment that Israelis are crazy enough to bring an end to everyone with nuclear weapons. But that's not much of a reassurance.
No, it's not. It's a very, very scary moment. I have two observations though. On the one hand, I am in the very bizarre situation to have been asked for the first time a few months ago to teach in international human rights law. And now I'm teaching human rights law right now, which is to me the greatest kind of contradiction. But then again, we are seeing something that is interesting, which repeats over history, which is that the weaker party still maintains or still sticks to international law, because Iran is the weaker party in this, Israel plus United States plus Europe equation, right? And they didn't attack another embassy, which they could have. That would have been direct proportional, right? But they decided let's not, because it still is better for everybody if we can show to the rest of the world, who's not the US and Europe, that we stick to it. And we see this over and over, that weaker parties try to stick to international law and try to also maintain the framing of it, right? It officially said we only strike military targets. I mean, they are very fairly and squarely inside that. So that gives me a little bit of hope. Second, that's an observation. Second question, where does Israel get its uranium from and plutonium? I don't think they cannot get it themselves, right? So how do they get around the mechanism of the NPT that restricts uranium and plutonium sales to places that are not part of it?
Well, there are various answers to that. The initial uranium for their nuclear weapons program was stolen from Pennsylvania. And they then got a lot of uranium from South Africa as due to their cooperation with the apartheid regime in developing nuclear weapons.
It goes that far back, the uranium that they still have now.
I don't know where they get it now. I'm sure there are plenty of people who are willing to sell uranium for an adequate price. Basically, international regulation of trade is always spotty. I want to go to your first point, your first observation. There's a great irony here. I think the edifice of international law, you mentioned human rights law, which you're teaching, is the great legacy of Euro-Atlantic culture and civilization. This is something that was invented really in the Enlightenment in Europe. The United States spent much of the 20th century trying to realize this in the form of institutions and rules, the United Nations, various international conventions, which we enthusiastically participated in drafting. More recently, we have not ratified any such kind of conventions, and we have shown total contempt for the United Nations. So I think what is really ironic here is that the global South, if you will, the colonized part of the world, which had these rules inculcated by their colonial masters, now is the great defender of them. And the West, which invented these rules, disparages and ignores them. And that exactly coincides with what you said. Namely, the purpose of law is the protection of the weak against the strong. And the weaker parties tend to be those, including countries like China, which began as a totally lawless revolution in 1949, but which is now a major defender of the Westphalian idea of national sovereignty and no interference in internal affairs and so forth, which is the backbone of the UN Charter. Whereas the US engages in regime change operations, ignores sovereignty, is at the moment occupying part of Syria in a totally illegal manner, is in Iraq and will not leave despite the demands of Iraqis, and so forth. So we have an inversion. We came up with some very good rules, admirable system that worked for a while. We have now abandoned that system because we're strong. And the weak are defending it because they're weak. And this is a very ironic situation indeed.
The weak suffer what they must, but the weak also do whatever they can. And a good idea remains a good idea. And this good idea was invented while the people who invented it committed genocide themselves, right? But the good idea remains a good idea. And it gives me a little bit of hope that other parts of humanity then pick up the good ideas of others, disregarding who invented them, and try to further develop them.
I don't want to veer off into a broader strategic discussion because I think we've covered pretty much enough ground to this point. But let me just observe that one of the collateral damages of everything that has been happening is the United Nations. It has been shown to be feckless, to be incompetent, to be a vehicle that cannot rise to the challenges facing the planet or human societies on the planet. And therefore, the question arises, is there an alternative to preserve those values that the UN was intended to exemplify? And my belief is that there are mechanisms to do that, and that the model for those alternatives exists in the various organizations and institutions that have been created to supplement, complement, and remedy the deficiencies of post-World War II institutions like the Bretton Woods banking system. So we have the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank, we have the New Development Bank, we have the BRICS, we have a whole series of institutions arising which have the potential over time to take over or usurp, if you will, perhaps that is a bad word, but maybe displace the role of the United Nations and certainly that of the global hegemon, the United States, as the formulator of rules and the enforcer of rules. There is absolutely no reason that the world has to put up with the American veto in support of genocide in Gaza. Why is there no ad hoc conference in which countries get together and authorize, for example, boycott, disinvestment, and sanctions against the perpetrator? It's an interesting question. Basically, the existence of the UN is becoming an obstacle to the realization of the ideals the UN was established to perpetuate. And so I think at some point, somebody's going to come up with an answer that we won't like, because it will deprive us, I'm speaking for Americans, it will deprive us of our veto. It will complicate international affairs in that the veto will also not be available to others, Russians, Chinese, French, whoever. And we will have a replacement for this organization, which, clearly represents the constellation of power as it emerged from World War II, but not the current constellation of power, and which also is serving to perpetuate an American primacy, which more and more countries see as an insuperable obstacle to accomplishing what has to be done. So I think this is a geopolitical moment, geopolitical sea change, if you will, in the making, and we're not seeing it quite happening yet, but we see bits and pieces that are very suggestive. And why should the UN be in New York? There were reasons for that. But are those reasons valid now? Shouldn't it be in Bermuda, or in Andorra, or some other place, Liechtenstein, maybe even Switzerland?
But the second headquarters is in Switzerland, right? Because the League of Nations used to be there. And this is the main reason why I do these neutrality studies, because as we see the current order crumble and move toward multipolarity, and as we see this 100-year experiment of the UN/League of Nations, which is the experiment of creating top-down structure, right? A pyramid. And this is failing. It hasn't done what it was supposed to, and everybody's seeing it. And as you're correctly saying, I think we're seeing now the gradual development of regional arrangements, BRICS, ASEAN, the African Union is getting closer together and is formulating problem-solving mechanisms and is replacing what the UN should be doing. And in this constellation, it will be more and more important to have actors that can serve as meeting grounds, and we're seeing it live. How Qatar is serving as a mediator, how Oman is serving as a mediator.
They're having second thoughts as we speak, due to criticism by pro-Zionist politicians in the West.
Oh well,
we're seeing the spillover from this. Well, you mentioned the legacy of the League of Nations and the presence in Switzerland and Geneva in particular of international organizations. The WTO, the World Trade Organization, has been sabotaged by the United States, with the result that there are more and more regional and bilateral arrangements for trade liberalization and dispute management, because the WTO can no longer serve that purpose. But there are other spillover effects. Look at the destruction of freedom of speech in Germany, for example.
Oh yes.
This is quite extraordinary. The German national security apparatus is now intent on silencing anyone who says anything remotely critical of genocide by Israel, and refusing entry to those people, breaking up conferences, arresting people. This is a kind of quasi-totalitarian activity that would have been unimaginable before what has now happened. Germany was a model democracy. It's losing that character, and so are others.
In the name of defending it. In the name of defending what you're yourself destroying. And it's so tragic. So tragic.
That is always the case. Every revolution takes place in order to reinstate mythical past values. Every counter-revolution takes place in order to defend the values of the society. and destroys them in the process. Both are very destructive. So here we are. Anyway, I think I have to take my leave, but I wish you a pleasant day in Japan.
Thank you, Ambassador Freeman, very much for your time today.
No tsunamis, no typhoons, and a pleasant meal, maybe some yakitori.
I will get some tonight. Thank you very much, Ambassador Freeman. All the best to you and enjoy your drink.
Okay, thank you. Bye-bye.